So over the weekend, yet more criticism came from essentially pretty much every single corner, and everyone is pretty much in agreement that this deal will ultimately harm British farmers. But of course, we have seen the typical Tory tactic kick into play of, oh, don't worry, this is going to be over a 15-year period, and we're going to bring in protections. Again, what these protections are, we don't know. Also, we don't know what the, shall we say, the finer points of the detail of this Australian trade deal actually are. So we don't actually know the full effects of what this is going to be. All we know is that there is going to be completely tariff-free trade by the next 15 years. And we've also heard from the Australian beef industry that they do intend, and they've been very open about this, that they do intend to flood our market with cheap beef. This is going to be an absolute disaster. A disaster for our agricultural industry, especially when we've said this before, 80% of all small farmers without the subsidies from the EU, which again have not been replaced by the government, even though they said that they would replace them with something, would go out of business. The National Union of Farmers spokeswoman said it right, that you can't level up and throw our small family farms under the bus. Well, unfortunately, first it was the DUP, then it was the fishermen, now it's going to be the farmers. And a lot of British industries should seriously be asking themselves this very simple question. Could we be next? It's a very valid question, and something that every single industry needs to take point of, because we also don't know what else could be in this Australian trade deal. At the moment, everyone's making a big fuss about farming, but we don't know what else is in it. And I said this before yesterday, the fact that we have done this in less than 6 months is not exactly a wonderful achievement. It should actually be quite worrying, because most trade deals take on average about 7 to 10 years to actually negotiate. And the fact that we've done this at speed, and the very fact that Australia has said, yeah, the UK's desperate to do a deal, should be incredibly worrying for anyone who has a business in the UK, because all of a sudden you now have to try and compete with incredibly cheap imports from Australia and potentially other countries around the world. This will not be good for UK industries, because the way you protect UK industries, one of the key things is tariffs. Or you subsidise them, you help them in some way. Why you give them tax breaks, or you give them money to help them export or import, something like that. So far, the Conservatives have offered nothing. And yet, just as with the Brexit deal, where we have seen the key dates for actual checks at our border, not the European border, our border, to take place, have been kicked down the road to October and to even early next year in March. There is a absolute pile-up headed this way when those checks start to come in, and it's going to be interesting. It's going to be very interesting, I'll tell you that now. But anyway, let's talk about some more about this critical reaction to the news of this Australian trade deal. So before we jump into that, please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button, and also down below there is a link to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people that do support the channel that way. So, this comes from The Observer, and the title is Irresponsible. Australian trade deal will bring ruin to UK farmers, critics warn. The UK government was facing a backlash on Saturday over its plans for a trade deal with Australia, which have led to anger from farmers and environmentalists and calls for a Scottish secretary to actually resign. Farmers' unions said that the proposals for a zero tariff and zero quota trade deal would drive farmers out of business, while Green groups said that allowing Australian hormone-treated beef would bring the Conservatives' manifesto commitments to ruin. The Scottish National Party added that the clamour for a rethink by calling on Alistair Jake, the Secretary of State for Scotland, to fight back or resign if he failed to stand up for farmers. Ian Blackford, the SNP leader in Westminster, wrote to Jack, saying that the deal would place a time limit on the future of farming livelihoods across these islands, so would also disproportionately affect the Scottish farmers and crofters. Such a trade deal would represent a very bitter betrayal for rural communities and the undermining and undercutting of our agricultural sector that would amount to a genuine threat to the future viability, Blackford wrote. If Jake's views are ignored by the Cabinet, Blackford wrote, then your credible option is to make clear that this is a resigning matter. The opponents of Scottish independence fear that the row over farming may fuel new support for another referendum in rural areas where there has previously been very pro-union support. Farming leaders were taken by surprise as the news that Liz Truss, the Trade Secretary, would offer her counterpart in Cambria a deal with a 15-year transition period, leading to completely unfettered free trade, without protections that farmers had actually asked for. Ministers are also aiming to have the deal signed before the G7 summit in Cornwall on the 11th of June. Monet Batters, the National Farm Union's president, said it was incredibly disappointing that the government had not told farmers the whole irresponsible about the proposals, that it should provide the details urgently. It is also incredibly concerning that the government is, in quote, in spirit to sign up to a trade deal with Australia that would have serious implications for British farming and would seem to offer very little benefit to the economy. The Department for International Trade estimates that UK GDP growth will be over 0.025% over the next 15 years as a result of that deal. Brett has said the Prime Minister and other people in his government have pledged to level up the country, agreeing to a tariff-free deal with a major agricultural exporter with no safeguards or review mechanisms would do the exact opposite of that commitment and set swathes of rural Britain backwards. Truss held talks with Dan Tehan, the Australian Trade Minister, who have outlined the UK's proposal to him, and she won the Prime Minister's support during the Cabinet meeting on Thursday, after apparently outmanoeuvring the Environmental Secretary George Eustice and Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove. Last year, environmental groups and farmers spent months lobbying ministers and emphasising that trade deals should not compromise food standards or animal welfare. In November, Eustice and Truss made a joint pledge not to allow imports of hormone-treated beef and chlorinated chicken as part of any trade deal. And Australian farmers are allowed to use hormones to make cattle grow bigger, and as a result, their meat is subject to an import ban by the EU. Tanya Steele, the chief executive of the WWF, warns that the government not to forget its obligations ahead of the COP26 meeting later this year. Rushing to align ourselves with the laggers on climate and nature without guarantees to uphold core standards invites lower standards of production on our shelves and risks exporting our environmental footprint rather than actually reducing it. Supporters of the trade deal, such as, surprise, surprise, the brain of Brexit, Daniel Hannan, have raised the prospects that farmers will receive subsidies for trying to maintain the countryside. And again, they are nothing compared to what I actually got. Again, this is nothing. It does not replace what they got from the EU. So not all farmers are enthusiastic about the idea of changing their role from food producers to park wardens. Tim Bonnier, the chief executive of the Countryside Alliance, said that the government expected farmers to manage the countryside and tackle the climate crisis, but farmers need to be profitable to actually do this. If trade deals increase competition and therefore reduce commodity prices over time, then farmers will require additional support and compensation to deliver on the public goods which are critical to meeting government targets, he said. A DIT spokesperson said that we keep farmers and senior figures from all across the industry closely involved throughout all the negotiating process. The Trade Secretary talked with the NUF this week, and ministers also met with the farming representative organisations, including the NUF Scotland, to discuss the Australian Free FTA. If an Australian deal would open up export opportunities for our farmers and include protections for the agricultural industry, while also ensuring farmers are not undercut and the high standards we have in place are not compromised. Again, very unlikely to happen. And it's kind of funny to think that somehow British farmers are then going to gain a foothold in Australia. Because here's the thing. The Australian beef industry has an absolute stranglehold on the Australian market. The idea that even if British exporters think that they can somehow make a foothold, even if they have zero tariff access, is completely laughable. Because no other country has even been able to try and get about a 1% advantage. Because that's how strong they are. Again, this is going to lead to incredible damage to our agricultural industry. And as was put there, not everyone wants to go from being a farmer and food producer to a park warden. Like I say, you can already see how ridiculous this idea actually is. It's a pie-in-the-sky fantasy, and once again, not surprisingly, it's coming from Daniel Hannan, the guy who said that only a fool would leave the single market. But there you go. So, as always, thank you for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And also down below there is a link to my Patreon page, as well as one Off Nation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, well, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you to everyone who does support the channel that way. And of course, hold on to your hats, because tomorrow Cummings is giving evidence. So that, ladies and gentlemen, could be incredibly fun. So, we'll see you all next time.